Okay, good.
Good morning. A little disclaimer at the beginning. Everything I say today represents my own views, despite my nearly 4 decades close association with the National Football League. I am not speaking for the NFL. I'm going to focus today on American sports, and particularly on the top of the food chain, the team sports in the major leagues. That's what I know the best. Before we look at the things that can corrupt sports, let's consider briefly why sports are important to us. First, of course, they have enormous entertainment value. Superb athletes produce intense, exciting games with unscripted, often very dramatic outcomes. I keep telling my wife that the only true reality programming on television is sports. Secondly, the economic impact of sports is obvious and it's enormous. It amounts to tens of billions of dollars every year in this country alone. But beyond entertainment value and beyond dollars, sports have considerable social utility. They're a source of individual and group identity. The team sports, I think, in particular, promote cohesion, and they provide rallying points within communities and regions. Tell me you folks in New England didn't get pretty excited with all the success the Patriots have had and with the Red Sox remarkable success in the last decade. And frankly, sports at their best have a lot to teach our young people, a lot of life lessons. Now, our pro sports are hardly problem-free. I can't think of an enterprise that is in America in any area. But they have largely escaped the parade of horribles that are discussed in some of your pre-reading material and that Bruce referred to a few moments ago. If you read the pre-reading materials, you may have come away shaking your head in disgust. But then you have to realize that the worst examples of corruption in professional sports that you read about had one thing in common. They did not happen here. Why are we doing better in America? Human nature, of course, is human nature. But cultures can differ very dramatically. And even the basic strength of societies, entire societies, can differ dramatically. This year early, there was a major game-fixing scandal in soccer uncovered in Greece. And in that connection, the Greek culture and sports minister commented publicly that, quote, there is a direct link between what is happening in soccer and broader Greek society. We know how badly broken Greek society is these days. Similarly, South Korea, 46 soccer players charged last month with match fixing. The president of South Korea observed, the entire nation is rotten. And you can say a lot of things about our country, particularly in light of what we've all been put through in the last month or so in Washington and on Wall Street. But rotten, I think, is not a word that you can fairly use about the United States. Now, there are skeptics and there are cynics. But I think most Americans who care about sports share 2 fundamental ideals and expectations. First and foremost, we expect that our sports are going to be honestly played, honestly run, and honestly officiated. And in addition, we are not always quite so insistent on this one. But I do think that most people would like to see and believe that those who participate in sports are law-abiding, respectable citizens. And they would like to be able to look at sports on the field and in terms of management and athlete participation as a generally socially commendable activity. The sponsors and the advertisers who pay so much to support our major sports have the same basic expectations. Accordingly, if you run or have a part in running a major league in this country, you have to know that your continuing success depends on two critical foundation stones. One is the integrity of the games as honest athletic competition. And the other one, equally critical, is public confidence in the integrity of the games, confidence in the organizations that run the sports, and to a somewhat lesser but still very significant extent, confidence in the basic integrity of the people who are involved in the sports. Without integrity, there's no public confidence, and if public confidence is damaged, the sport is in danger. Consequently, when I think of corruption in our sports, I think beyond the obvious, which is bribery, and I think that whatever threatens either the integrity of the enterprise or the public's confidence in it amounts to and can fairly be considered to be corruption. Maintaining integrity and public confidence is built into the rules of sports leagues. In the National Football League, for example, the league's governing documents give the commissioner the authority to impose discipline on athletes, on coaches, on owners, and on other team personnel for conduct detrimental to the integrity of or public confidence in the NFL. The other major leagues have similar formulations in their own rules. Nobody, of course, as I said, and no organization is perfect. But I believe that our professional leagues are able to do a much better job than the NCAA and the major college programs in dealing with corruption. And I think there are two major reasons why that is so. One is the fact that the overall college governance structure is very decentralized and fragmented. And the other is that college athletes are considered and treated as amateurs, which in turn requires a multitude of rules and prohibitions that are very difficult to monitor and enforce over this sprawling nationwide network of hundreds and hundreds of schools. The pro leagues, on the other hand, are led by commissioners, and they are far more tightly knit from a governance standpoint. And their players, of course, are paid openly and paid very well. Now, the greatest single integrity threat to any sports organization is dishonest competition. And what that typically means is fixed games or point shaving. You all know what a fixed game is. It's basically where players on one team rig the outcome, normally in terms of agreeing to lose the game. And the typical mechanism is bribery. Point shaving, anybody who doesn't know what point shaving is? Okay. Point shaving is based on the point spread that legal bookmakers establish in each game. Patriots favored to win over the New York Jets by 6.5 points. If you are going to try to shave points in that game, you will probably go to the underdog team, the Jets, and I'm using that example for a reason up here. And you might say, be sure that you keep the spread under this. Basketball is more typically a game that has in history seen point shaving, and it's a lot easier to do in basketball. For example, if you have a team that's favored by 10 points, you might go to the team that's favored and say, we're not asking you to dump this game, we're not asking you to lose it, we just want you to keep the winning margin under 10 points so we can bet on the underdog and win our bets. That's point shaving. Now, the first recorded fix in sports history involved a Greek boxer. Funny how Greece keeps coming up, isn't it? A Greek boxer who supposedly bribed 3 successive opponents in the Olympic Games to take a dive to lose to him. That was in 388 BC. And he presumably did that, as far as we know, for his personal honor, glory, and self-aggrandizement. But in modern times, nearly all fixes and all point-shaving scandals are caused by gambling interests when they prey on the greed and or the vulnerability of athletes. It's no secret that there is a great deal of gambling on sporting events worldwide. Some of it is legal, most of it is illegal. But whatever form it takes, gambling and sports can be a very toxic mix. To put it simply, if fans learn that they're being manipulated, if they learn that the games that they're paying to watch are not on the level, if they're being rigged by players who've been bribed by gamblers to alter the outcome, then the integrity of the sport is lost, the public quickly loses confidence in it, and the sport faces serious damage, even potential destruction. Baseball found this out the hard way 91 years ago in 1920, when it was discovered that the 1919 World Series between the Cincinnati Reds and the Chicago White Sox had been fixed. The White Sox were the best team in baseball at the time, heavily favored to win the World Series. Problem was, most of their players were very poorly paid. They had a very penurious owner, and the players were very indignant and resentful about that fact. Led by their first baseman, who was a thug by all accounts, 8 of them agreed, or supposedly agreed, to fix the series. I say supposedly because there's a little question about a couple of the players, whether they were really doing it or not, but they all had sat around in a meeting where it was discussed. F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby said that the resulting Black Sox scandal had, quote, played with the faith of 50 million people, unquote. The scandal, when it was uncovered, produced a media frenzy. It dominated the newspapers in this country on the front pages, and it shook baseball to its core, threatened to destroy its preeminent place in American life. The club owners realized quickly that they had to take strong, visible action to salvage their sport. So they hired a sitting federal judge by the picturesque name of Kennesaw Mountain Landis as the sport's first commissioner. Judge Landis agreed to accept the position if and only if they gave him absolute power to police the sport in order to keep it clean. And they did. The 8 Chicago players were criminally prosecuted in a state court in Illinois. There was no law at the time against fixing games. So they were charged with amorphous crimes like conspiring to injure the business of the American League, conspiring to injure the business of the White Sox, and conspiring to defraud the public. They went to trial in the summer of 1921, almost 90 years ago to the day. And after the trial, the 8 players were acquitted by a jury in Chicago. Pretty happy, backslapping, grinning, whooping it up. And they actually ended up partying in a hotel room with the jury that night. They walked out by dawn's early light, but their whistles and happy songs and backslapping ended rather quickly when they picked up the advance editions of the morning papers and they read Judge Landis's statement. I'll read it to you. Regardless of the verdicts of juries, no player who throws a ball game, who undertakes or promises to throw a ball game, or who sits in conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing a game are discussed and does not promptly report it to his club will ever play professional baseball. That was obviously a day before lawyers and the law became so deeply enmeshed in American sports, and it's good that it was. Because that statement, in addition to abruptly ending the careers of those 8 players, set the tone for the future. Baseball's rules quickly came to incorporate what Landis said. Over time, the pro leagues in football, basketball, and hockey came into being, and as they did, they adopted similar rules. Congress, some years later, would reinforce the concern about integrity in sports by passing a federal law making it illegal to alter or to attempt to alter the outcome of a sporting event by bribery. The other leagues, as they came into being, also followed baseball's example by adopting the commissioner form of self-government. When you think of league commissioners today, you probably think of them basically as CEOs of major corporations or major businesses, and in effect they are. But they have a higher calling, and it's embodied in the reason why the office of commissioner was first created, and that is to guard the games, to preserve the public's confidence in the sport. The historical record over the past 70 years or so has not been entirely unblemished, but by and large our professional sports here, in, I think, dramatic contrast to those in many countries overseas, have remained largely free of gambling-related corruption. As I said, every major instance of game fixing or point shaving anywhere in the world has involved gambling interests, often associated with organized crime. And they try to get an edge by controlling athletes' game performances so they know which side of the game to bet. Gamblers also try routinely to cozy up to athletes in an attempt, if not to alter their performance, in an attempt to get inside information that would, again, assist them in making their bets. Over time, our sports organizations have expanded their rules about gambling beyond what Judge Landis formulated. For example, every NFL locker room has signs posted that remind players on a daily basis of prohibitions that go way beyond throwing or fixing a game or failing to report a bribe offer. They include the simple act of betting on any NFL game. They include promoting gambling in any way, particularly sports gambling, and they preclude associating with gamblers or gambling activities in a manner tending to bring the NFL into disrepute. It's a pretty general formulation, pretty ambiguous, intentionally so. I wanted to make it as broad as possible. Other leagues have largely similar rules, and they have been invoked when necessary. A couple of examples. Back in 1954, the NBA banned a player named Jack Molinas, a Columbia University All-American, if you can imagine that, for having bet frequently on basketball games through a bookie. 8 years later, in 1962, the NFL suspended two of its highest-profile players, Alex Karras and Paul Hornung, for a year. What did they do? They'd been found to have made a few bets of about $100 apiece on their own teams to win. Not the worst kind of betting you can do, but the rules were clear, and the league said we need to send a message. And for having done that, Commissioner Pete Rozelle was selected by Sports Illustrated as its Sportsman of the Year for 1962. 1984, we had to suspend a quarterback named Art Schlichter, a three-time college All-American, a very high first-round draft choice in the NFL, who turned out to have a compulsive gambling problem. Started with the horses, extended into sports betting, and basically ruined his career. We suspended him indefinitely, tried to get him some help with counseling and whatever else you could do with a compulsive gambler. Said, if you can possibly get a hold of this and prove that you've gotten a hold of it, we may let you back in. Bottom line, he never could do that, and he never did come back. And of course, the most notable gambling-related permanent ban was imposed on the leading hitter in Major League Baseball history, Pete Rose, back in 1989, for having bet on the team he was then managing to win, and done so repeatedly through bookmakers. Now, even mere associations, as I said, mere associations with gambling interests have brought suspensions. For example, some of you may remember way back in 1947, Brooklyn Dodgers manager Leo DeRocher had to sit out a year after he had been found to be socializing openly with known gamblers. Flash forward to 1969. You remember when Joe Namath of the New York Jets, the quarterback, fresh off the upset Super Bowl win over the Baltimore Colts, was given a stark choice by Commissioner Pete Rozelle. Either play in the NFL or keep your interest, your ownership interest, in a New York City restaurant that had become a hangout for known sports gamblers. You can't do both. Joe made the wise choice. Sensitivities to gambling associations do vary somewhat these days among the major leagues. Some leagues are more sensitive than others and more strict than others. But it's fair to say that all of the leagues look very unkindly on associations with any sports gambling or with illegal gambling of any kind. What's the good news? The economics of our professional leagues make point shaving or fixing or conniving with sports gamblers highly unlikely. Unlike the White Sox players in 1919, unlike most soccer players in foreign countries these days, the athletes in our major leagues earn enormous sums of money. And they don't have to be too bright to realize that they have a lot more to lose by involvement with sports gambling than they could possibly hope to gain from it. All of that said, there is no room for complacency. Tim Donaghy was a 13-year veteran referee in the National Basketball Association, who you will probably remember was exposed in 2007 as having been deeply involved in gambling-related problems. He had a serious gambling problem of his own, and according to the FBI, Donaghy tried to recoup heavy gambling losses that he'd suffered by betting on NBA games that he was working, and then by advising sports gamblers based on his inside information that he'd gained as a referee. Information like players' physical conditions at a given point in time, or his impressions of how players got along or didn't get along with certain referees. Donaghy eventually pleaded guilty to conspiring to engage in wire fraud and transmitting wagering information in interstate commerce, two federal crimes, and he served a year in jail. The Donaghy case obviously threatened major damage to the NBA's integrity and public confidence interests. David Stern, the NBA commissioner, said, "This is the worst thing I have ever seen in all my years as a fan of basketball and as a lawyer for basketball and as commissioner of basketball," a period that spans about half a century. Stern stated the obvious when he said, "This is a wake-up call that says you can't be complacent." And he quickly commissioned an outside investigation led by a partner in a major New York City law firm into the entire referee program in the NBA, and apparently that review has prompted significant changes in how NBA officials are screened and hired, and more importantly, how they are monitored during their employment with the NBA. Now, Donaghy did not plead guilty to actually fixing games, and he didn't plead guilty to refereeing with an eye on the point spread. But there was a fellow who subsequently statistically analyzed the betting lines and the results of 15 games in one season, games that Donaghy was working. And this fellow concluded that Donaghy probably did referee with an eye on the point spread. And if that's true, that meant that he made calls or failed to make calls in order to stay on one side of the point spread or the other. There's no reliable evidence that the problem went beyond Tim Donaghy, thank goodness. But the NBA is still scarred by that experience, and they're still operating under something of a cloud of suspicion that they really don't need. And critically, if there had been any complacency beginning to creep into any of the other sports, there's no room for that now. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, so said Thomas Jefferson. Well, folks, eternal vigilance is the price of integrity and public confidence as well. All of the major leagues have very substantial security departments. They're staffed by former FBI agents and or by other experienced former law enforcement officials who have a lot of contacts and a lot of ability that keeps them able to be attuned to situations that might raise questions. Somewhat paradoxically, major allies in the effort to assure clean games are the legal sports bookmakers in Nevada, the only state in our country where significant sports gambling is permitted. Bookies don't want fixed games or manipulated games either, because they don't want to take heavy losses that are based on inside information that one side of the bet has and the other side doesn't have. What do you have to do to try to preserve honest games? They're pretty obvious. You have to constantly highlight and emphasize the rules to the players. You have to educate them about potential problem areas they may encounter in their day-to-day, week-to-week lives that are gambling related. You have to be persistently alert for any sign of trouble. If you get a disturbing report or even a disturbing rumor, you investigate it as thoroughly as you possibly can, and hopefully you'll get some help from law enforcement people. Frequently you do. But if a bad situation does occur, obviously you have to have a way to punish it effectively, either by the league or by the criminal justice system, or sometimes by both. Donaghy, of course, got both. He got a conviction, he got a year in jail, and he will never referee a basketball game again. Now, the second major threat to public confidence in professional sports is the use of performance-enhancing drugs, PEDs, by athletes. And our most serious problem over the years has been with anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids, as you probably know, are synthetic versions of testosterone, the male hormone, which we all have in our bodies in some degree, in some proportion. When used by athletes, steroids distort the competition. They inject an element of dishonesty by artificially making athletes bigger, stronger, and faster than they could otherwise be. And they pose other problems too. They can carry serious health risks to people who use them. When some athletes use them, they're coercive. If I'm on one side of the line in a football game and I think the guy that's banging me on every play is bulked up artificially, I'm going to be sorely tempted to feel like, even though I don't want to do this, I've got to do this to stay up in the competition. Coercive. We had an all-pro offensive lineman in the NFL emphasize this point to us about 25 years ago, and it resonated with us. And third, of course, I'm sorry, my daughter put the number 1 where the number 4 should be. Fourth, their use sends the wrong message to young people. Young people, young athletes look up to, admire, and try to emulate athletes at the highest level, and it's a hell of a bad example to set for them. How did anabolic steroids come about? Well, they were perfected and developed behind the Iron Curtain in Russia and in East Germany. They were first used by bodybuilders, and the first athletes to start using them were in track and field. Most of us, I think, in this audience will remember the days when the Russians and the East Germans dominated the Olympic Games. Do you remember that? Now we know why. It took until late in the 1960s for anybody in American sports to even consider that steroids might become a problem with our athletes. And when the realization dawned and people started paying attention and writing about it, there was considerable disagreement in the literature about whether steroids really did help athletic performance. And there was also considerable disagreement about whether they really did pose dangers to the users. But by the late 1970s, even the mid-1970s, there was enough scientific and anecdotal evidence available that the NFL took the step of banning steroid use. Football, obviously, because of the nature of the game, was the first sport in which people said, gee, there's a real interest in being bigger, stronger, and faster. So we felt that we were most at risk if indeed there was a risk. We banned it. Great. One problem. We had no way to detect it. There was no test for it. Now, in time, the International Olympic Committee got access to some of the East German scientists who were the true experts about steroids, synthetic steroids. And they were able to develop tests to detect steroid use. The classic example of using a thief to catch a thief. But the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, would not share their expertise with any professional leagues. They held it very close to the vest. We were the only sport at the time to be interested in getting access to the tests, and they wouldn't give it to us. And that situation persisted into the late 1980s. Before that time, only a very few American scientists were given any access to the IOC's inner circle, and they were sworn to secrecy about the testing methods and protocols. Meanwhile, of course, as Sandy will confirm, I'm sure, during that decade, the 80s, we and the other major leagues had our hands full with cocaine and other recreational drug use, which was a clear and present danger at the time. Steroid breakthrough occurred in the NFL a little bit in 1987 when we found an American scientist who, although not in the IOC's inner circle, had gotten enough information that he thought he knew how to test for steroids. So, armed with that semi-shaky ability, we told our players in 1987 that we would test for steroids for the next 2 years using part of the urine samples that athletes routinely give in their preseason training camp physical exams. But we said to them, we're going to test for one purpose. We're going to see if we have a problem in this sport or not with steroid use. Turns out we did. So in 1989, for the first time, and over the vigorous opposition of our players' union at the time, we began to suspend players whose preseason urine tests showed the presence of steroids, and we did, 13 in the first year. The true breakthrough came in the early 1990s, when the NFL's drug program was revised by essentially making the players partners in its formulation. By that time, we had finally gotten access to the Olympic testing labs in this country, and we were able to test with real confidence in the results. And a great deal of credit has to go to a gentleman named Gene Upshaw, now deceased. Gene was the executive director of the NFL Players Union for many years after his career ended on the field. And to his credit, he realized that steroid use was a terrible thing for the sport, and that steroid use would harm the players more than it would help them. And so with the union's cooperation, the NFL instituted systematic testing. What do I mean by systematic? Test every week, from training camp all the way through the season and through the playoffs. You test a number of players at random. You do it at random so that nobody can be complacent. Oh, I just got tested. I'm not going to be tested again. I'm going to load up with steroids. No, that's not what random means. We had one player a couple of years back, I remember, who was tested 4 times in 6 weeks. And he called up the administrator and said, what the hell is happening? And the guy had to explain randomization to him. It can happen. Constant testing at random is the way, basically, that the NFL has operated steroid testing ever since. So the only concern left at this point with steroids is who's winning the game of cops and robbers. Is it the bad guys who are trying to develop new drugs to escape detection, or the good guys who are trying to follow the bad guys and develop tests to detect whatever they're coming up with? At any given point in time, you can never be totally sure, but there's no reason for panic about it. The other major leagues have come on board as well, most notably baseball. You remember the congressional hearings back in 2005 that focused attention on Mark McGwire and Rafael Palmeiro and Roger Clemens and the others? Highly publicized. And baseball was, I believe, very embarrassed by this. Most particularly, its players' union was embarrassed by this, because it was pretty clear that management had the desire to stiffen and strengthen baseball's steroid program, which was really only a token program prior to that time, in my opinion. Players' union had resisted it. Players' union philosophy at the time was pretty much what most unions' philosophies is. Our constituents, right or wrong, will protect their interests, and that's what's required of us. Whatever the causes, baseball stiffened its steroid policy very substantially, and as far as I know, their program is very good today, and one can have confidence in it. What about basketball and hockey? Well, neither of those sports has any history, any documented history of steroid abuse. But that same congressional spotlight back in 2005 shone on all the sports. And in the wake of it, basketball toughened their steroid approach, and hockey put in something that was pretty meaningful. Neither program is as strict or stringent or complete as football's and I think baseball's, but at least they have the programs. How do you deal with it? What do you have to do to preserve integrity and public confidence where steroids are concerned? Obviously, you have to recognize that you've got a problem, or at least that you could have a problem, as we did back in the NFL in the early 70s. We said, we don't know if we do, but we might, and we probably ought to do everything we can to figure it out. If you find you have a problem, you have to commit to solving it. And the best way you can do that is to do it in concert with your players' union, rather than having them opposing whatever you're doing. Bring them into the circle, and you'll find, frankly, as we have found in football over the years, that they can be a very constructive partner. You have to have, of course, strict rules. You tell the players about it, you drum the rules into them constantly, and you enforce your rules evenly and across the board. Your testing has to be effective, as I said, regularly, at random. You need to test with no advance notice, or as little as humanly possible. And ideally, you should test into the off-season as well. Perhaps on a reduced basis, because the players are scattered all over, but every player in the NFL has to tell the league where he's going to be at any point, so that if his number comes up for random testing in the off-season, they know where to find him. And of course, you do need to have penalties that are strong enough to deter steroid use, and also to send a public message that you're serious about doing that. Again, eternal vigilance as the price of integrity and public confidence. A brief word, though, in this area about human growth hormone. You may have seen some headlines in recent days that the NFL is about to become the first major league sport to test its athletes for HGH. Baseball has been doing it for some years at the minor league level, where the players' union has no jurisdiction over the players, but it's not being done in baseball. It's questionable at this point. The technology really isn't there. There are no urine tests for HGH yet. The only test is a blood test. So it makes things more awkward, more difficult, and vastly more expensive. But the NFL has gotten great credit in recent days, even from people who don't know quite how effective the testing will be, for making the stand and taking the step of doing it, institutionalizing it. And again, the players' union leadership agreed to it, which is a point in their favor. The spotlight is on it now, and if there is HGH use in sports, I think the athletes who are tempted to do it or continue to do it are going to have to think a little harder about it, because they know that the spotlight is shining now more intensely than it ever did before. Now, beyond gambling-related misconduct and beyond PED use, the third variety of what could become sports corruption is what we can generically call bad behavior. When players in a sport engage in criminal conduct or antisocial conduct, it generates a lot of negative publicity. The athlete has the most to lose. Consider what Tiger Woods has lost in recent years. Consider what Michael Vick has lost in recent years. But in the team sports, the athlete's team and his entire league are going to be tarnished by association, because every media report of any kind of bad conduct is invariably linked with the team and the league in which the team plays, because that's why the athlete's name is worthy of note. And that's true even with athletes who've been retired for 20 years. I mean, you could have an NFL player who's convicted of drunk driving who retired 20 years ago, and when that hits the papers, and it will, it'll be so-and-so of such and such team in the NFL. Does bad conduct always rise to the level of corruption? No, not always. But it can if it's bad enough to cause people to think that it is systemic, to the point where they say, well, that's what those people do. The most graphic of that, example of that I know of, goes back to the late 70s, early 80s, and basketball. That was a time, as we all remember, when a street drug culture of some virulence had taken hold in this country. All the major league sports, as I said earlier, were grappling at that point with what you do about cocaine and other illegal drug use. The NBA was going through especially hard times. Even though young stars like Magic Johnson and Larry Bird had emerged, the public appeal of the NBA had fallen so low that in 1 year, their ultimate championship game, Game 7 of the finals, was televised on tape delay outside prime time. Can you imagine? That wasn't because people thought NBA basketball was not a good product. And it wasn't because people didn't trust the honesty of NBA basketball. It was because it was widely perceived at that time that NBA players were bad actors. I vividly recall one writer who commented way back at the time that a popular perception of the league was that the NBA was composed of, quote, a bunch of tall black guys in shorts who do drugs, unquote. Unfair, of course, inaccurate, but powerful. Guilt by association. Enough incidents of that kind occur, get into the public consciousness often enough, pretty soon you've got generalizations and guilt by association, and you've got what some people could come to be perceiving as a corrupt situation. Now, the NBA obviously had to do something about it. So in the 1980s, the early 80s, they became the first league to adopt a drug program that was a product not of unilateral management action, but of agreement with the Players Association. And that was widely hailed at the time in the sports media, and it should have been, because it was a big step. The only problem was that it didn't even cover marijuana, focused on cocaine, which is good, but they had a problem with marijuana. It took them a few years to catch up and put that into policy, but they eventually did. The other leagues at the time were tackling street drug problems in their own ways, and the players' unions, as I said, were largely resistant and sometimes vigorously so in their preoccupation with individual player rights. It took a lot of years before the unions finally got on board to a meaningful extent, and what could be fairly called joint programs were developed and collectively bargained. I think now it's fair to say that the street drug culture in sports has changed considerably for the better than what it was many years back. Now, besides illegal drug use, leagues have had to deal with various types of antisocial conduct by pro athletes. Gun-related offenses, assaults, bar fights, drunk driving, violence toward women. The responses collectively among the major leagues in our country have been somewhat uneven because the various leagues have different histories and different cultures, and their commissioners have differing degrees of latitude to act against these kinds of offenses under the collective bargaining agreements that are in force through the leagues. But all the leagues, it's fair to say, will act if the misconduct is serious enough, unless, of course, the criminal justice system beats them to it, which is fine if they do. And unless the criminal justice system sends a firm enough message to the public to say, okay, the point is made and we, the league, don't have to do anything else. That was the case with, for example, in the NFL with Michael Vick, who paid a terrible price, including a couple of years in jail for his dogfighting involvement. And with more recently with Plaxico Burress, the receiver who caught the pass that beat the Patriots in 2008, who missed a couple of seasons of football for having been dumb enough to take a loaded gun to a nightclub in New York and have it go off while it was still in his pants. He could have paid a greater price, but the typical approach that those leagues have taken is to wait to take disciplinary action until after the criminal justice system plays out the player's criminal case. But the NFL did something different a couple of years ago. Commissioner Roger Goodell, a young man who I can remember as a first-year employee in our office back in the early 80s, who's come a long, long way, done very well, he staked out new territory. We'd had a personal conduct policy in the NFL for years, and it had evolved and broadened out and strengthened. But Roger took it a step farther when he said, I believe I have the authority under our collective bargaining agreement to take action, if appropriate, before there has been any criminal adjudication or disposition of a case. Well, why would you want to do that, Commissioner? One might ask. And his response was, I will move against anything that undermines or puts at risk the integrity and reputation of the NFL or its clubs or its players. He went on to say, these incidents affect us all. Every investigation, every arrest, every allegation of improper conduct undermines respect for our league by the fans, lessens the confidence of our business partners, and threatens the continued success of our brand. In other words, a judicial determination was no longer going to be a prerequisite to disciplinary action. The first example of Commissioner Goodell's exercising the power involved a player named Adam Jones, the Pac-Man. Anybody remember that? Pac-Man Jones? He's a defensive back, so he doesn't get the publicity except when he does stuff like this. He accumulated something like 6 arrests in a period of less than 2 years. And every one of them, of course, brought increased negative publicity because every succeeding one advertised again the previous ones that were still pending. No dispositions, 6 pending cases. The commissioner said enough is enough. He got a long suspension, and his lawyers, although they complained about it publicly, reflexively, as you might expect, they came to realize that they probably would not succeed in challenging what the commissioner did. Since it imposes a higher standard than just avoiding criminal conduct, the NFL's approach obviously is unique in its strictness. And again, I think the NFL Players Association gets credit for having recognized that it's ultimately in the best interest of the players as well, because it's in the interest of the entire enterprise and the way the public feels about it. Just in this last round of collective bargaining, there were some players on the executive committee of the union who publicly said, we want to curtail the commissioner's power in cases like this. And reportedly, the union's executive director, its hired professional leader, said, hey, I'm a former prosecutor. I know where they're coming from, and I think this is not a bad thing at all. So that has not changed. And at least for the next 10 years in the bargaining agreement, it's going to stay this way, and it's probably good for the sport. Certainly most fans I've talked to in the last couple of years who've been aware of this have appreciated it and said that's a good thing. Now, pro athletes are not the only ones who can damage a sport's integrity. Management, sad to say, can do it, and they can do it at the team level, they can do it even at the league level. On a league level, probably we think of the people who considered baseball's indifference, apparent indifference to widespread steroid use in the 90s and the early 2000s as amounting almost to a collective systemic wrongdoing, a willful ignorance, if you will, or a willful refusal to deal with the problem. Don't think that's fair, but we're talking about perception. Now, by background, you remember baseball was badly hurt back in 1994. Players' strike cut the season short in August, as I recall. No World Series. Well, a whole bunch of people were very, very angry about that. Many fans were very bitter, and they turned away from the sport. And the strike got settled the following year, and at that point, baseball clearly needed a boost to recover. Fortunately, it seemed at the time, the years following that strike saw a major surge in power hitting, home runs. In 1998, a few years later, Roger Maris's long-standing single-season home run record was not broken, it was shattered. Sammy Sosa hit 66 home runs. Mark McGwire hit 70. Left Maris and Babe Ruth and those guys in the dust, statistically. And it was frankly very exciting. I remember all the attention focused on it as the season wound down. These two guys were matching each other almost home run for home run. Well, interestingly, in the year that that was done, 1998, baseball hit its high watermark in Gallup polls. In that year, 56% of the American people identified themselves as baseball fans. That's an excellent number, superb number. Problem was, about that time, suspicion about steroid use was also increasing. And as that suspicion continued to grow in the ensuing years, baseball showing in the polls started to slide from that high in 1998. Some years later, 2005, Jose Canseco writes the book Juiced, a tell-all book detailing his own steroid use and claiming it was widespread in baseball. That book prompted congressional hearings, the publicized ones that I alluded to earlier, and it resulted in a very, very substantial toughening of baseball's steroid program. But meanwhile, Barry Bonds had bulked up, become the preeminent home run hitter, shattered McGwire's record, and he did that at an age when most players' careers are winding down, if not over. Then when two Bay Area reporters uncovered the Balco lab and its connection with Bonds, baseball's perception problem got even worse. Baseball did its own study back in 2007, spearheaded by former Senator Mitchell, and it confirmed that there had been widespread use within the sport. And when Bonds and McGwire and Roger Clemens were implicated, it was perfectly clear that steroids had come to reach the highest levels of the sport, and probably enabled some of the sacred records to be broken by cheaters. Not coincidentally, look on the far right of the graph. By 2008, according to Gallup, baseball's popularity had dropped fully 25%. That is a huge, huge drop. And of the fans that remained, slightly more than half of them said they had become, quote, less enthusiastic, unquote, about the sport. Now, there may have been other factors involved in that drop, but there's little question in my mind that the credibility that baseball had lost institutionally because of steroids contributed very significantly to it. When you lose a quarter of your fans and you disillusion half the others because of something that they come to perceive as institutional neglect, you have paid a heavy price in public confidence. Now, the NFL, in fairness, is also dealing with a problem that could have mushroomed into a perception of corruption at the management level, but I think they caught it in time, and that has to do with head trauma. You've seen the reports in recent years about head injuries in football. Well, bottom line is we know more now than we did even 2 or 3 years ago. You recall that the long-time culture about football was, he got dinged, got his bell rung. And it was a mark of toughness when the player, after getting dinged or getting his bell rung, shook it off, put on the helmet, went back in the game. This tough guy is what we want. Well, The mounting evidence that's become available just in the past few years has said to the NFL, we could have a real problem here, that the extent of which we didn't realize before. Even today, some doctors say that there's a correlation statistically between chronic dementia developed later on by former athletes and their participation in football, but there's no causal connection proven. Well, the NFL basically has said, we're going to err. If we're wrong about this, we're now going to err on the side of caution. And they've made some fundamental changes. They now require any player that's been concussed, had a concussion, even if it's a minor one, he does not come back in the game. Or if this happens in practice, he does not come back into practice for the rest of that day, no matter what. Doesn't matter if he can recite the list of presidents from George Washington on, he's not coming back that day. And he's not coming back at all until a neurological expert, not just the team doctor, but a neurological expert clears him to play. That's a big step forward. And last year, Commissioner Goodell really jacked up the disciplinary penalties for certain kinds of hits on the field that involve players' heads. 6-figure fines in some cases. And a cascade of criticism by some players saying, you are putting dresses on us. You're turning us into sissies. Well, then wear them well, because that's the way it's going to be. The league is making, in other words, an institutional effort to get ahead of a situation that it might well have gotten very far behind, by even changing part of the culture of the game in order to avoid the widespread perception that they are indifferent to health and safety factors. When management level misconduct does occur, it occurs more often at the team level than the league level, and I don't think it doesn't rise to corruption unless it is frequent and systemic or perceived as such. They're typically one-off examples, single team breaking a league rule in an effort to get a competitive advantage. We've had a couple of instances reported in basketball and in football which have salary caps of teams making secret contracts with players, putting them in a drawer, and reporting a different, lower number to the league in order that the team can stay within the maximum salary cap for a given year. When these have been uncovered, the penalties have been draconian. Very large fines, suspensions of personnel who were involved on the management side in the transactions, large fines on the team. Even forfeited draft choices. The Minnesota Timberwolves in the NBA, there's a reason why you haven't heard much about the Minnesota Timberwolves, because back in the year 2000, they were found to have had a secret contract with a guy, and the reaction was from the NBA was that the general manager was suspended for a year, the team was fined a large amount, and they were stripped of 5 consecutive first-round draft choices. Gutted their chances. Now, 2 of those, I think, were restored after 3 years of good behavior, but still, taking away 3 first-round draft choices in a row means you're not going to hear about the Minnesota Timberwolves. And, of course, you folks up here remember Spygate. Everybody remembers Spygate? When the Patriots were caught videotaping opposing teams' defensive signals during games in violation of an NFL rule. Well, that little misadventure cost the Patriots $250,000 in fines. It cost Bill Belichick $500,000 out of his pocket, and it took away the club's first-round draft choice in 2008. Now, taking draft choices, as you know, is serious business, and it is typically an effective deterrent, not only to that team, but to everybody else who knows about it. And it also tells the public that a league cares about fair competition and will fight to preserve it. In summary, and I've gone too long, I apologize if I have, we in America are fortunate that we have not had to deal with the kind of crap that we have seen in other parts of the world at the management level. We don't have club or league managements buying favorable referees or bribing referees or colluding with players to fix games or facilitating players' drug use or other types of systemic misconduct. And if we keep the eternal vigilance, and if we're lucky, we can stay that way. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. I apologize for having to leave abruptly later this morning, but I have a meeting with bankers in New York, and at this point in time, bankers are greatly appreciated by the New York Mets. My only real concern about my travel plans is the fact that Bruce is driving me to Manchester. What I'd like to do today in following up Jay's excellent presentation this morning is try to be a little more anecdotal and maybe provide a slightly different frame of reference for corruption in sports. I have been a league administrator, I've been a team official, I've been involved as a CEO and as a general manager, so I've got a lot of experience with some of these issues. The congressional hearings, which took place in 2005 and headlined Mark McGuire and Jose Canseco, I also participated in as a less than headliner. I've been on 60 Minutes discussing these issues. I've testified in front of George Mitchell, so I've been involved in a variety of these different forums in a variety of different capacities. What I'd like to do today is talk about really four separate areas. One, I thought it would be important to define sport. As Jay did, I think it's important to keep in mind what sport represents to us as a country, as a culture, individually as sports fans or participants or administrators. I think also keep in mind what it is that undermines fan interest in sports. Where is sport vulnerable? And what are the things that, against which it has to be most protective and about which most concerned. I want to talk a little bit about the key constituencies and risks that are apparent to sport, that to which sport is highly vulnerable, and then talk a little bit about preventative measures. So what is sport? You know, when I left the Padres and before I joined the Mets and went to the Dominican Republic for Major League Baseball, I taught sports management at Berkeley. And one of the things we start with each course is really trying to define what sport is. And of course, competition is one of the things with which we most associate sport. There are a lot of other connotations too, depending on whether you're a father or a daughter, or there are all kinds of associations, emotional, financial, and so forth, that we associate with sport. But certainly competition is one of those essential elements. Derived from that basic definition is this notion of sportsmanship. So that sport is a competitive activity, and sportsmanship is really the conduct of that competitive activity. And what's interesting, I think, about this slide is that, at least with respect to sportsmanship, the definition comes from the Merriam-Webster English Dictionary. And one of the things I want to leave you with today is the notion that American or English definitions of sport and sportsmanship are not necessarily controlling in today's sport world. I think that there, as I will get into a little bit later, there are cultural norms that exist in other places, and to some extent exist here in the United States, that are beginning to change our notion of sport and what constitutes sportsmanship. And I think those changes, that evolution in and of itself, is a risk. The other aspect of sport that I think is probably subsumed in the competitive notion is that it's unpredictable. It's unscripted. You know, today entertainment is divided into two worlds, really. Reality television and scripted television. Reality entertainment, scripted entertainment. The '69 Mets would probably be a good example of the kind of unpredictable, unscripted emotional association that we have with sport and with competition. The World Wrestling, used to be Foundation, is another good example of what I would now call scripted entertainment, and in fact what the World Wrestling Entertainment Inc. now calls itself, and probably as a result of perceived corruption in that area of sports entertainment. If you go back 20 years, 25 years, I don't think the World Wrestling Federation would have considered itself scripted entertainment. In fact, there's a whole different perception that existed at that time, or an attempt on their part to create a different perception. But with drug scandals and a host of other things, it's interesting now that the World Wrestling Entertainment Group considers itself scripted entertainment, basically has acquiesced in the notion that everybody else understood for many years. A couple of examples going back a few years. Some of us will probably remember these two instances of what I'll call fairness. One had to do with DiVincenzo's loss of the Masters in 1968. Shot a birdie on a hole. His opponent recorded a 4, had to live with a 4, lost out on a potential playoff. But there has been this sort of honor code among golfers that has existed for many years, and the sport has essentially relied upon, that made this almost sort of a mandatory result. On the other hand, in 1983, a fight that was fixed by a trainer putting plaster inside the gloves of a fighter in a not a well-known fight, but certainly well-publicized these days, and Billy Collins, who was the one who suffered tremendous injury, ultimately died a couple of years later, I believe, in an auto accident. But what was interesting about this was the fact that the Boxing Commission, I believe in New York, had someone actually physically watching the fighter's hands being taped and the gloves being tied onto his hands. And the point was made that a very skilled trainer could take horsehair out of a padded glove and insert plaster into a taping, even with someone physically watching him as a representative of the Boxing Commission. So the question is, okay, so we have a sense of what sport is. Then the question becomes, what undermines fan interest? And I think Jay went into this quite extensively. But I want to take a slightly different approach to it. I know this is a little bit of a complicated slide. But my basic premise is that within sport, it's not a matter of complacency or attention. It's more of a continuum that results from sort of a amused detachment from certain things that ultimately can lead to the kind of outrageous conduct that begins to undermine the sport itself. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So take poor officiating, for example, and I'll come back to this in a second. In baseball, you know, we have the area play at second base. Sometimes on a pivot on a double play, whether the second baseman or the shortstop is actually touching the bag is questionable, but nonetheless the umpires call that player out. Usually it's because the given rationale is that they don't want the middle infielders hurt, and if they spend too much time on the bag, that's more likely. But what it does is it gives the umpires a latitude that at some point in some application of latitude can be very problematic. It happens with the strike zone, and I'll come back to that. As we get further along this continuum, things become obviously more significant and more dangerous to the sport, and we get to the point where we're talking about PEDs and match fixing, and I'll come back to that in a second. Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, where how we approach the game generally can lead to the kinds of outrageous conduct that lie along the far end of this continuum. I'm sure many of you have heard of Gaylord Perry. If you're a baseball fan, you remember Gaylord Perry from years ago. Gaylord Perry's in the Hall of Fame. He's one of our most recognized, most applauded players in history. And yet he got into the Hall of Fame by cheating. He got into the Hall of Fame by throwing a spitball. Very well acknowledged. He himself acknowledges that his success in the game had to do with his ability to, quote, doctor the ball. Interestingly today, by the way, again, if you're a baseball fan and you watch the games, watch how frequently balls are thrown out of the game. The average baseball is used for, I'm going to say, 2 or 3 or 4 pitches. If the ball touches the ground, the umpire throws it out. Now, I supervised umpires for quite a while. I'm not sure why they do that today, except that maybe somebody at Rawlings gave them a new pair of shoes. But my point here is that Gaylord Perry wouldn't be in the Hall of Fame if he were pitching today, because he couldn't doctor the ball frequently enough and effectively enough to have the success he did, because the balls are only in play for 3 or 4 pitches. And you know, at some point it's difficult to doctor every ball that they throw back to you and do it effectively in 10 or 15 seconds. But my point is that with Gaylord Perry, we kind of laugh about the fact that he, you know, threw a spitball and he got away with it, and that's part of the lore of the game. And yet, it's really acquiescence on the part of the sport, on the part of the game, to a significant violation of the rules. Now, the fact that it happened in, you know, in the 1910s and 20s and 30s and 40s, at some point it became illegal. It became illegal for a reason, and yet there was a delay in not just the enforcement of the rule, but also the recognition of its significance. Does that lead directly to the use of performance-enhancing drugs? No, it doesn't. But at the same time, I think that what it can do, it can lead to a type of complacency in which it takes some time for people to react to something that is no longer an amusement or an interesting footnote to baseball history, but is a real threat to the sport itself. The same is true in a slightly different context, I think, here. Again, one of the things I did at Major League Baseball for a few years was oversee the umpires. And when I first came in, I said to them, look, we have a strike zone. It's in the rule book. It's well defined. You're not calling it. And I insist, Major League Baseball insists, that you do that. It's nice to send out a memo that says that you're going to call the strike zone. But the real difficulty is figuring out how to enforce that edict, and enforce it in the face of resistance on the part of the umpires. And whether that resistance was individual, whether it had to do with the union, really didn't make any difference. It really required, however, that management overcome that resistance to try and get a uniform strike zone. Now you say to yourself, well, why a uniform strike zone? Because lots of people in baseball will say, look, every umpire is a little bit different, and we have to adjust to the umpires. Well, there are lots of reasons why we needed a uniform strike zone, but my point to the umpires was, look, my goal for you is to be the most respected officials in any sport, amateur or professional, anywhere in the world. That was almost a quote. And that really notion of respect had to do with perception. It had to do with the perception of people, not only in the baseball community, but also fans. There are about 280 pitches that are thrown every game. 280. roughly as an average, and about half of those are called a ball or a strike. So each game that you watch for the Red Sox, you get about 140 impressions of that umpire behind the plate. That he's good, he's bad, he's consistent, he's inconsistent, or what have you. And so my view was that 140 impressions every game was a significant, had a significant impact on how these umpires were viewed. And so the idea was to try to get the strike zone as close as possible to the definition in the rule book. And that required the introduction of some technology and a whole host of things. But ultimately, the most important element of enforcing these rules was a systematic management commitment of resources and time to make this happen. And I mention it in this, mention management responsibility in this context because anytime you see a problem, it can be as a result of ignorance, it can be a result of naivete, but often it is simply an abdication on the part of a commissioner, a commissioner's staff, a team staff, an abdication of a basic management responsibility. Sometimes, again, it's not intentional, but without the resources and without the manpower and without the commitment, problems can arise. Now, we talked about Tim Donaghy before. Jay brought him up. One of the biggest problems with officiating at all levels is really a lack of attention. When I took over the umpires, basically the umpires union was running umpiring in Major League Baseball. They made the decisions, they had committed the resources, and they really had the power to overcome any sort of management approach on our part. You recall in 2000 that all the umpires in Major League Baseball resigned. Any of you remember that incident? Well, that was in response to my taking over the umpires. They all resigned, and one of my few memorable quotes was when I was informed that they had resigned in mass, I said, that's either a threat to be ignored because it was a resignation for a future date. They were resigning roughly August 1st to be effective 3 weeks later. I said, it's either a threat to be ignored or an offer to be accepted. And I honestly did believe that Major League Baseball would be better off within probably 2 years if we had a completely new umpiring staff. In any event, most of those resignations were rescinded, but we ended up making significant improvement in that area because we devoted time to it. But when you don't devote time and you don't devote resources and attention, you can end up with a situation like the one faced by the NBA. The problem is probably even greater potentially at the collegiate level. Jay mentioned that college athletics administration and oversight is highly decentralized. That is absolutely true, and particularly with officiating. Officiating is governed by each conference and not by the NCAA. The only place where the NCAA gets involved in officiating is in its men's and women's championship tournaments at the end of the season. Otherwise, if you're playing again, if you follow the Patriot League makes its own decisions with respect to officiating. The same is true with the Pac-12, the Big 12, the Big 10, et cetera, and very few resources have been devoted to officiating at most levels, and as a result you see some of the problems that have arisen, up to and including game fixing and gambling. What I thought I'd do is run through the sort of key constituencies and risks. We talk about corruption. Okay, so who's involved in this? What's really going on here? So what I've done is just outline a few obvious categories: agents, athletes, coaches, administrators, officials, and thought we'd go through these one at a time and give you a little bit of color with respect to each one of them. So agents, we have agents involved in the game. Everybody knows that most professional players are involved with agents. possible actions on the part of the agents, disregard of collegiate restrictions. One of the things that's interesting about agents is that the problems that exist with respect to agents vary from sport to sport. And one of the reasons for that is just follow the money. So when players come out of, when basketball players and football players come out of college as distinguished, let's say, from baseball players, very different circumstances. Until this collective bargaining agreement in the NFL, for example, for top draft picks, the biggest contract they would ever get potentially from the NFL, in many cases, was their initial contract, the one coming right out of college. And as a result, agents would fall all over themselves and do whatever they could possibly do in some cases to acquire a client prior to the NFL draft. Same was true to some extent with the NBA draft, because the big money was coming immediately. And as a result, you end up with problems with Reggie Bush and a host of other players who get involved with agents even as they're attending college at USC or other places. It's in part because the big money in some of these sports comes immediately upon graduation or turning professional, notwithstanding graduation or what have you. In baseball, it's a little bit different. Usually the big money comes later. Players are signing a minor league contract. They often don't get big bonuses, and so we don't see the same problems with agents in baseball because the big money doesn't come immediately to baseball players. And interestingly, as players go through the minor leagues, like any consumer, they're able to compare and contrast various agents who represent various of their teammates, and they end up being pretty good about selecting an agent as they get closer to the major league level. So in baseball, we don't have the same problem with agents, with one exception, and this comes from my recent experience in the Dominican Republic. We have tremendous problems in Latin America with agents, otherwise called buscones, who do more than represent their players financially. They also train them, and can often train them from ages 11 or 12 to the point that they're 16. And this goes back to the lack of institutions in places like the Dominican Republic that don't have strong educational systems, don't have strong social institutions or programs for young kids, and particularly for young kids who come from the socioeconomic groups where baseball players are prominent, which would be players who are mostly of Haitian, African descent as opposed to Spanish, European descent. The culture there is bifurcated. For those of you who know the history between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, my point is that these kids who come through these programs in places like the Dominican Republic will do almost anything to escape their circumstances, and those who use those players for their own devices almost feel free to do whatever is necessary to promote their success and at the same time participate in it in the form of big commissions. An agent in the United States typically gets about 4 or 5% from a player, just as may be the case with entertainment agents. In the Dominican Republic, the agent for a young player who signs with a major league team can get 50% of what that player is to receive. So agents, for a variety of reasons, I'll give you, we just traded Carlos Beltran to the San Francisco Giants. We had the possibility of trading him to the Red Sox. They were looking for someone to play right field. J.D. Drew was playing right field, apparently not very well. Some of you can attest to that better than I can. The same agent represents J.D. Drew and Carlos Beltran. So I don't believe this ever became a factor, but certainly the possibility was discussed that because Carlos Beltran had a no-trade clause and could decide where he went, would his agent allow him to go to the Red Sox and displace another client? I don't believe that would have been the case. I don't think that was the case, but it certainly is possible, and these apparent conflicts of interest can come up in the context of an agent quite often. Athletes, obvious benefits that can result, but I think that one of the things that I mentioned earlier about the definition of sport and sportsmanship, think about sport from our perspective. Let's take hunting, for example. I'm not sure what element of competition exists in hunting, but even here in the United States, hunting is viewed by many as a sport. Take that a step further, cockfighting. Is cockfighting considered a sport in the United States? Well, no, it's illegal, as is dogfighting. But in other places around the world, cockfighting isn't illegal. It's part of the culture. It's been in existence for many years. And in fact, Pedro Martinez got some criticism in recent years for being involved in cockfighting in his former country, and place to which he would return in the off-season. The idea of financial gain, I think, is a strong motivator for almost anyone in any culture. But as I said before, with respect to some places in Latin America, it can be absolutely overwhelming. And if I had photographs of representative of the abject poverty in which some of these kids grow up and the families exist, you can, to some degree, understand the temptation. In dealing with age and identity fraud in the Dominican Republic, as well as PED use, we have had many instances where an entire community was involved in the fraud. And that's because the entire community was dependent on the success of a single individual kid, maybe 13, 14 years old, ultimately making it to a professional contract. The poverty there is overwhelming. And so the notion of what's acceptable and what's not, what's good sportsmanship and what's not. I've seen situations where in international competition, all the bats from a particular nation were illegal. All of them. But in some places, it's not about the fairness of the competition, it's about winning. That's all that matters. And I think that one of the things we have to constantly be aware of and vigilant for is that kind of thinking seeping into our sports institutions. We have to be very careful about that. And I'm not pointing fingers at any one culture or place, but to the extent that our players come from different parts of the world, we have to be aware that there are different norms, different expectations, different levels of responsibility that come with that. And frankly, corking a bat in the Dominican Republic is no big deal. And in fact, it's not about fairness, it's not about honesty, it can be, in some cases, getting over on the man. And that's something we have to be constantly aware of. Looking at drug use, and we'll maybe come back to that in a second, but Jay made a very good point earlier, and that was the distinction between recreational drug use and performance-enhancing drugs. And in the late 70s, well into the 80s, the real focus was on recreational drugs. And I mention that simply for two reasons. One, I think it was such a focus that, at least in baseball, there was a real delay in understanding and having a sense of what was going on with respect to performance-enhancing drugs. If you go back to the mid-'80s, weightlifting, weight training, that kind of training didn't even exist in baseball. There was a real, within the game, there was a real almost universal rejection that weight training could actually be helpful. And actually in Oakland, we were one of the first to introduce weight training as a team-wide endeavor. We did some other things too. We brought in interestingly, we brought in the first mental coach for baseball, who was actually a high school guidance counselor in Vermont. We had a minor league team in Vermont, and he used to come out to ball games, and ended up having a 25, 30-year career in baseball. Harvey Dorfman was his name. Some of you may be familiar with that name. Very incredible guy, but really the first mental coach in baseball. To have an image of Harvey, to think of Phil Silvers and Sergeant Bilko. Perfect. Sergeant Bilko in a baseball uniform, and you've got Harvey Dorfman. What actually caused us to begin weight training were two things that stick out in my mind. One, we had a coach at the time, actually a player at the time, named Dave McKay, who was a player, very fit, and did weight training. Became a coach for us, and as a first base coach, then took over some duties as a weight trainer. And really, the extent of his duty was to get the guys out of bed and take them down to basically 24-hour fitness every day. Actually get them in the bus, take them down there. That was the extent of his expertise. But what got me to think about weight training for players, I was not a weight trainer myself, was Carlton Fisk. And if you remember, when Carlton Fisk had already left the Red Sox, gone to the White Sox, and had an incredible increase in his power production one year. And it turned out that Carlton had decided to lift weights during the off season. And he had great power production early in the year, and it went downward because he didn't do any training in the season. But it was sort of the first time that some of us began to think about weight training for baseball. But because it was kind of a first step, there was really not the awareness that should have existed for all of the other things that might be attendant to weight training. And ultimately, with performance-enhancing drugs, that's exactly what happened. So athletes, agents, coaches, and staff. I didn't put Ohio State up here for any particular reason, but the other thing that I want to just emphasize in the college arena is this underlying issue of, quote, amateurism that Jay referenced. It's a very difficult concept to maintain in today's world. If Ohio State or Michigan are putting 100,000 people in a ballpark, in a stadium every Saturday, and the players are trying to figure out whether they can afford to buy a number 2 meal at McDonald's on Thursday, there's a real imbalance there. And the imbalance is one that's almost untenable. And even today, the NCAA president, former president of the University of Washington, has been talking about paying college athletes. And while he says that idea is untenable as far as he's concerned, there are discussions about how more forms of compensation in terms of other sort of non-cash benefits can be conferred on young athletes. But it's this imbalance. It's the perception of what one part of the equation is getting and the other part is not getting that can lead to the kinds of violations that have existed, that apparently existed at Ohio State. It's just a tremendous imbalance that it just cannot continue. And I think that's inevitable. It's sort of systemic, as Jay suggested, that there are going to have to be changes. Now, the other thing, right down here at the bottom, I just wanted to talk about is sign stealing. This goes back to baseball. And sign stealing is, the kind of thing, a coach might sit on the bench or a player, and they watch the third base coach. The third base coach is giving signs, and they try to figure out the signs so that they know whether a guy is stealing. They can then, in turn, pitch out or what have you. That's one form of sign stealing. There's another form of sign stealing that involves cameras, zoom lenses, and a host of other technological methods to try and get the signs from the opposing team. I have walked into one place that I walked into a room, I saw a staff member, and this is maybe 2 weeks after I arrived at an organization. I walk into my box, which is adjacent to the press box, and there's a kid with a camera and a zoom lens focused on the third base coach. I said, "What are you doing?" Well, he didn't answer, but I knew exactly what he was doing. I threw him out of the room. The thing that was so, not only was it inappropriate, but right next to this little booth was the press box. So he was, I'm sure, being viewed by, 20 or 30 members of the press, if we had that many following the team at the time. And it does exist. And by the way, with respect to that or any other thing that comes up from time to time, my basic approach to what goes on within a club is I always assume full information. And this goes back to the high profile of sport, but various other things. I assume full information on the part of the media. Not that they have it currently, but they will ultimately get it. And that your conduct is going to be measured ultimately by all of the facts, and you have to be willing to live by what you've done or what you've allowed to take place. So whether that's a practical judgment on my part or otherwise, I don't know, but that's how I approach things. So with respect to sign stealing, there are acceptable levels and there are unacceptable levels, and this goes back to that continuum notion, and we have to constantly reevaluate what's acceptable and what's not, and recognize that some of the things that we find acceptable can lead to more dangerous permutations of that acceptable conduct that can really potentially threaten the institution and have tremendously negative consequences. Administrators. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but clearly in the administration of the IOC, selecting sites for Olympic Games, probably are aware now that FIFA, the International Soccer Federation, is undergoing real scrutiny over its awarding of the next World Cup, I believe, to a Middle Eastern, Dubai or someplace in the Middle East. But there are places and organizations around the world in different places that take these things more or less seriously. And I don't think there's any question that FIFA does not take this kind of stuff very seriously. It just doesn't. I don't think the IOC took it seriously until it felt its brand was at risk. And if any of you have dealt with the IOC, you know how insular and how much hubris the IOC can demonstrate. I spent a few years trying to keep baseball in the Olympics. I went to IOC meetings in Mexico City, Athens, Singapore, and what have you, various places, and I can tell you it's one of the most insular organizations you'll ever find. And I've actually said on occasion it's the last colonial power, because most of its membership is from Europe. They have about 110 members, and almost a majority are from Europe. And yet, most of their revenue, most of their popularity, but most of their revenue from television and other things comes from outside of Europe. Whether it's the United States, historically with its television market, or emerging nations like Brazil and China and so forth, most of their revenues are generated overseas. And yet they have this Eurocentric attitude toward things that I think has left them vulnerable. They just do things differently. They're subject to the kinds of risks that we see with our sports institutions in the United States, but until recently, they've been sort of impervious to that risk. And I think FIFA is another perfect example of the kind of hubris that can be exhibited by sports institutions that have a tremendous amount of power and maybe are governed by different cultural or legal or political norms. Officials, I was the one that said, look, if you want to fix a baseball game, go after the home plate umpire. You know, one of the difficulties in dealing with officials in most sports is that some of the calls are so subjective. That's certainly true in the NBA, and it's true to some extent in baseball as well, particularly balls and strikes. If you think about the calls that umpires make in baseball, how many of them are really subjective? Well, there are a few, but there are not. You know, in other categories, they don't come to 140 a game. 140 times a game, an umpire is making, if we don't enforce the strike zone, is making a subjective judgment about the strike zone. And if you don't think that creates a risk, whether it's subconscious, could be retribution. One of the things I fought in baseball with respect to umpiring was the notion that veteran players should get an advantage over young players. Where in the rule book does it say that a 10-year veteran should get the benefit of the doubt over a rookie? It doesn't. So, you know, whether it's subconscious, whether it's, and again, there are umpires, and we can document this with this QuestTech system that we had, and now there's a new system that MLB.com uses, but we can see that some umpires are better in the first 3 innings of a game and not the middle 3 innings of the game. Why? Not because they're doing anything intentionally, but because there's a lack of awareness. Maybe there's a low blood sugar. Who knows what it might be? But I think you have to be aware of that in order to manage it. And the key thing is seeking out the information and then having the willingness and the commitment to try and manage it. Because it's one thing to have the information, it's something else to actually manage the problem. Often in baseball, and it's probably true in a lot of other, not just sports, but other endeavors, we have a problem, and then people say, well, gee, we dealt with that problem last year, why can't we fix it? We got to fix it. And through my experience, my response often is, look, some problems can't be fixed, they have to be managed. It's the difference between a broken arm and diabetes. You know, you break your arm, you put it in a cast, it's stronger than ever when you're done 6, 8, 10 weeks later. With some other condition, you have to manage it. You know, you've got to take your medicine, you have to go to the doctor. It's something that's chronic, it doesn't ever go away, but it can be managed. You know, you can live with it, it doesn't have to kill you, etc. A lot of problems we have in sport are chronic. They're not acute. The problem of performance-enhancing drugs is not acute. It's not something that's going to be fixed in a static sort of way. It's dynamic. As Jay said, there's always something new. And while in baseball we have very stringent testing, who knows what, you know, the next development will be with respect to PEDs. We've banned HGH in the minor leagues. That's, I'm sure, being negotiated right now with the major league players and in the new CBA that would go into effect next year. The fact that the NFL has it is a good thing for baseball. It creates an opportunity for us to piggyback on that. But it's something that's not static, it's dynamic, and we have to keep devoting the resources and committing the leadership to these problems in order for them to be managed, not necessarily to be cured. So, appreciate you all very much for being here, and happy to answer some questions.
what will happen, I will pose the question, and then I'll simply turn the microphone over to our guests here. And there are lots of questions. Many of them were the same, but I think you'll get the general idea as we move forward. Let me start with this question that could have gone either way with today's speakers. This is a quote from the New York Times of Saturday. "What a spectacle of undignified behavior, of hypocrisy, of extremism, of civility abandoned, of epic brattiness. Could a disgraced nation possibly have proved itself more worthy of its reputation?" Now, you're going to think that's focused on something that happened in Washington. Let me read the next sentence. "No, the spectacle, the antics in Washington, not there, but at Comerica Park in Detroit in an alleged game between the Angels and the Detroit Tigers." The question is, how long can the American sports fan tolerate the boorish behavior that is being acted out on the playing fields in our time?
We could tolerate it for a long time. And the reason is it doesn't happen that often. What the question alluded to was a rare situation, and if it's hardly corruption. Think what corruption means. To me, it generally connotes something either incredibly serious on its own, or more often something that is systemic. Baseball and all the sports have rules against that kind of behavior. When those rules are violated, they're punished. And for a whole variety of reasons, they don't happen that often, and I personally cannot conceive of anything like what happened there being thought of as corruption. Unfortunate, yes. Corrupt, no.
That particular incident involved a pitcher who threw a beanball and the hitter who put on a grandstand performance after he got his hit. Next question. Has any player ever turned in another player against violation of the rules and regulations of the league in which he plays?
Turned in another player for what?
Violation.
For violating rules? Yes. Yes. We had an incident. I don't want to name names because some of the people are still alive, and as far as I know, that excuse me, this has never come out, but back near the time when I first joined the NFL, we had a situation on one team where a number of players were smoking marijuana, and you could tell it most often when you watched, after we got the report, we went back and took the coaching film of a preseason game involving this team and another, and it turned out that all four of the players on the team in question who played on the defensive line, where you have to react when the football is snapped to what the offensive linemen do, all four of them were reputed marijuana smokers. And when you watched this film, you could see it, because every time the offensive line just drove into these guys and knocked them about 3 yards back, they couldn't react. And it turned out that 2 players on that team who were not marijuana smokers and who were distressed by what had happened informed the league of their suspicions. Those suspicions were investigated, and eventually something like a dozen players on that team were fined publicly for having used marijuana, even though there was no court involvement, no nothing. We just had the information, and we said we're not going to wait for this to play out in court. It's never going to get to court. It's low-level stuff as far as law enforcement's concerned, but it's not low-level to us.
Please comment on the, quote, bad methods some colleges use to recruit their athletes.
I talked too long when I was up here the first time. I'm not taking that risk again. In my view, let's get one thing straight. If you are fans of Dartmouth football or football at this level, which I have been for many years, sometimes very happily, other times not, happy last year, you have nothing to worry about. As far as I'm concerned, the Ivy League does it perfectly. And the problems are with the big schools, which Sandy described. Recruitment is one of the major problems. along with seemingly endemic rule violations. The rule book is this thick, and it's kind of hard not to violate it, but that seems endemic in major college programs. And, of course, academic dishonesty is also a serious problem. But the recruitment is tough. There are serious problems. Sandy mentioned that the agents are out there. They're parasites. They latch onto these kids, and the kids are young and impressionable, and sometimes they come from needy circumstances. And it's not terribly surprising sometimes that coaches that parents and these kids say, well, my God, this is huge business at the college level. Ohio State or any other, big schools, Michigan, they all put in these hundreds of thousands of people every week. They're making a ton of money. I can't even let somebody buy me a hamburger. If an agent comes along and provides something under the table, very hard to resist. And I frankly don't see it stopping at any point. I think it's a question of managing as well as you can, but I think the perception of corruption is out there, and frankly, I don't think I'm going to live long enough to see that perception disappear.
How long after steroid use will a test reveal it?
Depends on the steroid. Some of the original synthetic steroids were, when taken in any significant quantity, were detectable for months and months and months. I don't know of any steroid, and I may not know what I should know, but I don't know of any steroid that doesn't remain in the system for a considerable period of time. As opposed to, say, a street drug, and marijuana as a street drug will remain in your system for quite a while as well if you are anything more than a casual, a couple of tokes on the joint or whatever the terminology is. That may disappear in a day or so, but chronic marijuana use or anything like it will remain for quite a while. Cocaine can disappear within a matter of a day or so. Steroids, the length of detectability is not thought to be a major problem.
There must have been a dozen questions that ask this, comments that ask this question. Can you please comment on the escalation of professional football and baseball salaries over the last decade?
I think I already did. Whatever we may think about it, and we all have our opinions on the relative priorities that we have in this country on the economic level, it's hard, and yet it is, in my view, a fundamental reason why we can manage corruption at the professional level, because the temptations are simply not there for athletes who are making 6- and 7-figure, and in some cases 8-figure salaries.
The term student athlete, now completely obsolete at colleges where national championships have assumed far more importance than academic excellence. How do you address this divergence between athletics and academics?
You address it in books of approximately 500 pages, and you do not end those books with any answers that are practical in the real world. You can, at best, try to manage it, but in my view, you are going to manage it, and again, this is only at the highest levels. It's not in the Ivy League, it's not in the Patriot League, it's not in, numerically, most of the programs, athletic programs in this country's colleges. The problem's at the highest level. It's just really hard to deal with, and I don't know that it's ever going to be resolved. If you try to professionalize the student athlete, quote unquote, and I always say quote unquote when I use the NCAA's terminology, you are going to risk, among other things, making the big programs tens and hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue taxable, which they are not now, because they're part of the overall college's educational mission. I just don't see how they're going to solve it. I think at best they can try to improve things. They're meeting right now in a big conclave of college presidents who are meeting even today as we speak on the educational and other problems in the NCAA. They're going to address it. They might be able to do things on the margin, which cuts down at least marginally on the problem, but it's not going to solve it. Mike Slive, by the way, some of you have heard the name Mike Slive. He was a classmate of mine here at Dartmouth, a friend. He's the commissioner of the Southeast Conference, which is the largest and probably dominant college athletic conference today, certainly in football. And Mike has recently been quoted publicly as saying that college sports have lost the benefit of the doubt. And I agree with him.
How is the money that is taken from players who have violated rules and regulations, how is that money used in both leagues, both football and baseball?
I don't know what they do in baseball. In football, it is contributed to charity. It's to a group of charities that is agreed upon between management and the Players Association.
How, talking about sports at a little lower level in college university, one writer suggests that there are problems with Little League elbows. They're no joke. What rules are in effect to prevent permanent injuries among young kids in baseball?
Number one, how would I know? My impression is that I don't think there's an overarching structure that mandates certain things in Little League, but I could be wrong about that. I think it's more a matter of education, of getting the word to the parents of these kids who are interested in their health, that there ought to be some limits on the number of pitches thrown. For example, the pitching is the typical place where a kid can ruin his arm. By overuse or by teaching him to throw pitches that are thrown at higher levels that little kids shouldn't be trying to throw. And I think it's just a matter of constant attention and the good faith and goodwill of the coaches and vigilance on the part of the parents and of whatever governing structure they might be at a given place at a given time.
This question was asked by a number of people. In a word, will Pete Rose ever be admitted to the Hall of Fame?
Obviously, I can only have a personal opinion on it, and I don't have a crystal ball. I could frankly see a divergence with respect to Pete Rose. I do not believe he ever will be or should be permitted to be employed in organized baseball ever again. Hall of Fame question is slightly different. The problem is that what Pete Rose was doing as a player was, it clearly has Hall of Fame potential. If anybody has Hall of Fame qualifications for what he did on the field, Pete Rose does. And his gambling was not, as far as we know, related in any way, shape, or form at any time to his performance on the field. The problem he has is that the gambling rules are so central and so critical that many people will never forgive him for that, just for having put a stain on baseball, even though it happened after he had hung up his uniform and taken off his cleats. For me to say will he ever or won't he ever, I don't know. I could imagine that somewhere down the road attitudes will soften to the point where he is elected to the Hall of Fame, but I certainly wouldn't predict it, and I obviously can't guarantee it. But I do think, as I said, that he should never be permitted to work for any organized baseball entity in the future.
Why has Congress exempted baseball and football from the antitrust laws?
By mistake? Wait a minute. What was the question? And football? Well, football is not exempt from the antitrust laws. Football is exempt in very limited ways. There are exemptions from the antitrust laws for league-wide television contracts, but that's not just for football, that's for all the sports. And there was an exemption to permit the merger of the National Football League and the American Football League back in the 60s, after they had fought with each other and they were kind of destroying both sports with economic warfare for 6 or 7 years. And Congress realized, I think quite properly, that it was in the interest of this country to have a larger single league under a single administration where all this warfare would stop and the league could be strong on a broad basis, and that in fact has happened. Baseball's exemption traces back to the early 1920s, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., and it really is due, and I don't want to get esoteric, I mean, I teach this and it covers about 4 hours in the course that I teach. How to summarize it briefly. The prevailing view of interstate commerce at that time, back in the 1920s, was a very crimped view. The rationale of the decision exempting baseball from antitrust laws was that an antitrust violation has to occur in interstate commerce, and the courts tended to look at sporting events as discrete local affairs. Even though players traveled across state lines to play these games, it was thought at that time, with this crimped view of interstate commerce, that the interstate commerce was not implicated. That's a view that would have been blown out conceptually about 20 years after that, as notions of interstate commerce expanded dramatically. And it was perfectly clear that had the Supreme Court had the ability to start over, they would not have reached that conclusion. But the rationale in 1972, when Curt Flood brought his suit attacking the reserve clause in baseball under the antitrust laws, was basically one of precedent, what they call stare decisis. Baseball had been left to develop over a period of many years on the assumption that it was exempt from antitrust laws, and the court said, it's not for us, after all this time, as wrong as the original decision might have been, to change it. If it should be changed by Congress. Congress has considered that and rejected it. In fact, Congress at one point came very close back in the 60s to expanding the antitrust exemption to all the sports. And if it hadn't been for a congressman from Brooklyn, New York, who was really irritated after the Dodgers left in 1957, and who was the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, I'm told that that might well have happened, and it might be that all the sports would have been exempt from the antitrust laws, but that didn't happen, and consequently baseball's exemption, anomalous as it is, continues.
It's been discussed the number of very serious injuries that happen in professional sports, mostly football rather than baseball. The head trauma issue is one that's discussed over and over and over again. Has there been any motion made to improve the helmets to a degree that cheap shots, if you will, are not going to render a football player either incompetent or worse?
The helmet manufacturers, excuse me, who are few in number, run a very difficult business. You don't make money making and selling football helmets in any appreciable degree. And the reason you don't is because it takes one lawsuit for multi-million dollars to put a real crimp in the bottom line of every company, and you can't really get insurance on it anymore. So it's a tough business. Notwithstanding that, their scientists have been at work for many, many years constantly trying to improve the safety of football helmets, and perhaps improvements, incremental improvements, are possible, and some have been made over the years. But even as they have been made, the force equals mass times acceleration equation is also increasing as players just normally, I mean, as you can see among non-athletes from generation to generation, they're getting bigger. And they're getting stronger, and they're getting faster, and they're doing this without PEDs. And the fields don't get bigger in football. So there are going to be head injuries in football. The question, again, is you can't make the game, you can't take them away from the game, but what you can do in the way you make and enforce your rules, and the NFL is constantly evolving in this direction, you can try to minimize them. You're never going to eliminate them. And helmet technology is just not going to be able to do that. Now, I do think had the helmet safety factors not been dramatically improved over the last 30 years or so, the problem would be a whole lot worse than it is today.
Are you like Dartmouth monitoring some helmets so that when someone gets a hit, those on the sidelines know it and they pull a player out?
Well, when somebody gets a hit that rings his bell or dings him, as they used to say, it's pretty obvious. Sometimes he goes to the wrong sideline when he comes out of the game. Sometimes he wobbles and staggers. Sometimes he gets to the sideline and his eyes are glazed and they're not blinking, and they say, what's your name? And he says, I don't know. I mean, it's no secret when a player is concussed. It shows. And there is much more of an effort now than there was many years ago to pay attention to that. I mean, it's no longer, I think the culture of, oh, what the hell, shake it off and go back in, that culture is gone. I mean, and that culture has existed on a lot of levels. I could tell a story about Dartmouth football, which I won't tell, when I was here a long, long time ago, and concussions. But I don't consider inattention on the sidelines to be a real problem anymore.
We've got time for one more question, Pete tells me. How do sports unions come into play with respect to addressing and helping to solve problems of sports corruption, especially in your areas of responsibility?
Well, the corruption potential that I addressed earlier is in respect of PED use. And as I said, we've been very fortunate in football that the late Gene Upshaw had the attitude that he had, where he wasn't reflexively saying, well, if management wants to do it, we consider it a violation of the players' rights to test them systematically and try to remove these things from the game. Gene did not take that attitude. And his cooperation meant that for the last 20 years, roughly, players and owners together developed a tough program. And I don't think the program would be nearly as good, or would have been nearly as good as it was and continues to become without union cooperation. So they have a big role. If they want to be obstructionist, which the baseball union, in my view, was for many, many years, focused as it was on individual rights, the problem can be allowed to develop. And I think a big part of baseball's perceived inattention problem up until recent years, before those 2005 congressional hearings, was a result of the union being recalcitrant, as well as a result of some people on the management side saying, hell, we need the attention that these home runs are bringing, we'll get the fans back. So I think both the NFL and baseball's experiences have illustrated that unions can be very, very important parts of addressing that problem.
Allow me a few more seconds. I have a story to tell. It was told me by a graduate student of mine some years ago at the University of Washington who went on to play professional football. He said, you've got to share this story. It's apocryphal, but I think it's a good one. Two giant Midwestern universities have had a fabulous football season, undefeated. At the end of the season would pit University X against University Y. Huge game. Thousands, tens of thousands of people would come in to see this game. Millions of dollars would be made, win or lose. On the eve of the big game, the English professor in University X went to the president and said, Mr. President, I've got an issue. The two star players, both All-Americans, much sought after by the pros, they just flunked their final English exam, and under the rules we have here, you pass, or if you don't pass, you don't play. Well, the president and the professor went at one another for hours and hours and hours, and finally it was resolved, not happily by the English professor, that he would give the two fabulous stars a makeup exam. So he summoned the two gentlemen to his office and said, all right, chaps, this is against everything I believe in, but under the circumstances, you're going to get a makeup exam. Here, I'm going to give you the same question, and then I'll leave the room. I'll be back in an hour. Same question, one question. Fill in the blank. Old MacDonald had a blank. You got that? Old MacDonald had a blank. All right, gentlemen, I'll see you in an hour. Professor leaves. Shortly after his absence is noted by the players, one turns to the other and says, Stanley, what's the answer? And Stanley rubs his head a little bit and he says, I think the answer is farm. Farm. Oh, says his companion. How do you spell it? And his friend answers, E-I-E-I-O. Thank you very much.
One of those mine.